Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what is our first webinar of 2022. A bit late to say Happy New Year, but it is our first webinar of the year, having had a bit of a break over the festive period. First thing I need to say is a bit of housekeeping. I normally forget this, so I'm going to get it in first. You don't need to worry about taking notes as we go along. The webinar is being recorded and the recording and the slides will be made available on our website in the usual way in a day or two following the webinar. So yes, first webinar after a break. Probably a good time to remind everyone that these webinars are provided by people in our community who've got something to share, good practice, good ideas, top tips. So anyone who's got anything that they'd like to share, get in touch so we can push the programme forward this year. Our volunteers this week are Mel Blackmore and David Algar of Blackmore's, a company who specialise in supporting companies towards certification. Today's topic is Carbonology. That was new to me when I first heard it. It might be new to most of you, which is why you've tuned in for the webinar. I did wonder whether it was inspired by Maureen Lipman, but there's probably not many people listening who will get that reference, so we'll probably move straight on to introducing the speakers. I'm not going to steal their thunder. I'll hand you straight over to the first speaker. That's going to be Mel Blackmore, Managing Director of Blackmore's. Over to you, Mel.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, so it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for attending this webinar today on achieving carbon neutrality with certain ISO standards that we're going to be talking about, which is ISO 14064, the carbon verification standard, and also PAS 2060, which is the carbon neutrality standard. So yeah, I'm Melanie Blackmore, Managing Director of Blackmore's, and I'm also delighted to be joined by carbonologist David Algar, who will be taking you through some of the technical aspects of the standards and also taking you on a journey to achieving carbon neutrality with carbonology. So let's dive in. Okay, so today we're going to be giving you an overview of the two most popular and credible standards in the world in this space of carbon management, which is ISO 14064 and PAS 2060. And we'll also be taking you on a journey through how you can achieve that with Carbonology, which is a unique methodology that combines both 14064 and PAS 2060 compliance. Now, one of the great things about these standards is that they are linked so that you can integrate those standards seamlessly. Now, we work with many organisations that are certified to other ISO standards, such as ISO 14001 and 50001. And this standard isn't much different in that they can be integrated, okay, with your existing management system, but they do dovetail into each other quite nicely, which is something that David's going to be explaining about in a bit more detail later on within the webinar. Okay, so part of that is going to be taking you through the 7 steps in Carbonology. Okay, so how to achieve carbon neutrality from the initial outset, which is going to be understanding your scope and boundaries and subjects, which David will explain in more detail about, right through to your carbon reduction plan, offsetting, and then moving on to your formal declaration of compliance with PAS 2060 to be carbon neutral. Okay, so we'll be talking about offsetting as a topic on its own as well, because it is a very topical area. So we'll be looking at what the standard says about offsetting, which is quite interesting. And we'll also then close with talking about some of the drivers and some of the benefits around being carbon neutral, and why adopting proven methodologies such as 14064 and PAS 2060 can be beneficial for an organisation. Before we dive into the standards though, I thought it might be beneficial to give you a bit of background on who we are. Blackmore's is an organisation based in Letchworth Garden City in Hertfordshire, and we're a leading ISO standards consultancy firm. So we specialise in British and international standards for the implementation, maintenance and development of those standards. We have been operating for over 15 years now, and I'm very proud to say that our team have a 100% success rate for achieving certification with our clients. So that's across three main areas: quality, standards, risk, so health and safety, information security, business continuity, and also environmental standards. And it's the environmental standards where we've seen the biggest growth in demand over the last few years. So many of you will have heard of ISO 14001, the most popular environmental standard, but I know many of you will also have been involved with energy audits and energy management through ISO 50001. But you may not have heard of some of the other standards that businesses are adopting now. Some of them are sector specific, such as Sustainable Event Management Standards, ISO 2012-1, or sustainable procurement standards, which are actually guidance documents that businesses are adopting as well. Okay, so all in all, we've had exposure and implemented over 20 ISO standards for companies across multiple locations, so that's including 27 countries, and we've worked with over 500 clients now. If you want to hear a bit more about standards and the clients that we work with, there are lots of interviews and guides on how to implement ISO standards over on the ISO show. So that's a leading podcast that we've got that you can access on any of the main players such as iTunes or Spotify. So that's enough about us. Back to the topic on sustainability, and to expand on that in a little bit more detail, because I think we've seen, as I said, an increase in demand for environmental standards, but I don't think I've seen in the last 15 years that I've been running Blackmore such a demand for interest in carbon standards, and it's really grown in demand throughout COVID. I think there was definitely signs of it before COVID, but now I think if people aren't talking about COVID, they're talking about climate change and what they can do about it. So the demand and reason to act responsibly, I don't think it's ever been as compelling as it is today. I think in the past, some businesses have simply paid lip service to sustainability, but I think everybody recognises now that that just simply isn't good enough. The time to act is now, if you're not doing so already. But the challenge, that we find with a lot of businesses is that it's all well and good having the best intentions to do the right thing, but one of the greatest challenges is looking at ways in order to be able to do this in the right way, in a credible and consistent way. And so that's why, obviously, we're quite biased. We do love our standards, and that's because these are international standards of best practice that technical experts have come together to demonstrate that best practice. So this enables us to address some of these issues that businesses are facing, which is businesses want to reduce emissions, but they don't necessarily know where those emissions are coming from. Okay, and they don't know how to find that information. They want to achieve carbon neutrality, but they're not sure where to start. And now we're seeing an influx of carbon neutral products and services across all sorts of different markets. I mean, I was in a supermarket at the weekend, and I was looking at the wine, as you do, and I picked up a bottle of red wine that had carbon neutral label on it. So straight away my eye was drawn to it, picked it up, and I wanted to check it out. What's their story? What's their background? What's their methodology for being carbon neutral? Is it legitimate? So yeah, there's a lot of interest in this topic at the moment across lots of different products and services. So, you know, the question is, you know, what is your company doing about this? Is it on the path to carbon neutrality? And hopefully this webinar will provide you with, you know, to help you to steer you in a direction of carbon neutrality if you're not on that journey yet. But businesses are also being asked questions, not just by, you know, their employees about what they're doing, but also by potential clients and existing clients. So there is a need now to be able to instantly respond to tenders, you know, that do request environmental credentials. And in fact, I had a conversation with a tech company earlier this week. This is a multi-million-pound type organisation, and about 30% of the questions that are coming up in tenders are based on sustainability. Okay, so it is a serious issue. We know that there is a climate emergency. We do need to act responsibly, but it's about understanding, you know, what's a legitimate, credible method that we can actually, you know, start this journey. So, you know, the question is, you know, how can they meet these needs and address the climate emergency, and how can this be achieved in a consistent way? So that's where Carbonology comes in. So just to explain a little bit about the background here, as I mentioned, there's been an increase in demand for environmental standards, and we recognise that these two standards, ISO 14064 and PAS 2060, which we'll be sharing insights on in this webinar, we knew that this could potentially be something that businesses may find useful. So we did a pilot, we looked at the viability of it, we applied that to an organisation, and we recognised that these standards were basically shouting out from the rooftops, you know, this is the methodology that you could use as a best practice way of getting to being carbon neutral. Okay, so that's when I basically developed these 7 steps in Carbonology, which David will explain about because he's the expert on this now in a little while. So what makes this unique? Okay, well, rather than just paying lip service to the climate emergency, Carbonology provides a proven methodology based on those 2 standards for sustainable success. And obviously this is underpinned by the leading global carbon standards, 14064 and PAS 2060. So Carbonology combines a wealth of experience of helping businesses together with our innovative and thought leadership in assisting businesses on that journey to carbon neutrality to achieve the standard successfully. So some organisations are adopting this and not going for verification. Others are, because they do want the independent verification. Okay, they want the badge. Okay, so that's entirely up to you in terms of what your strategy is, but we're there to help you with that, put that methodology in place. And the standards are a great source of reference if this is something that you're interested in learning more about. You know, as part of your sustainability roadmap, Carbonology also provides the option to demonstrate credibility and confidence against the standards that it's based upon. So, you know, once verified, you know, your carbon footprint, you've got that option to issue a self-declaration, which some organisations are doing. Some are going down the second-party audit route or third-party independent audit and verification, which is, you know, this is the route that an organisation like CIBSE can offer, similar to the ISO 14001 and ISO 50001 certification. There is also a route for verification as well. And then on to carbon neutrality, PAS 2060. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, what does PAS stand for? That stands for publicly available specification. So that means it is a standard that you can either certify or verify against. Okay, and there is a difference, by the way, between certification and verification. Certification, you'll be used to that if you're certified to ISO 14001 or ISO 50001, Verification is different because we're actually looking at a set period in time, and it's a different set of requirements. So it's a verification process. Okay, I guess it's a little bit like an MOT. You know, your MOT certificate will be valid for 12 months because it meets the requirements at that time for a period. Okay, and so I guess it's similar in a way for verification. Okay, so certification, as you know, is valid for 3 years, whereas verification is for a set period of time. So let's say your period of verification was for January 2021 to December 2021. That's the period that the declaration is going to be for. But I won't get into the nitty-gritty of the technical aspects of it right now, because that's something that David will take you through in a moment. So, speak of the devil, I'm actually now going to hand over to David to explain about the standards in more detail and take you on that journey of carbon neutrality. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Mel. So my name's David. I'm the carbonologist at Blackmore's, and I'll just be talking through the standards and some of the practicalities of implementing them. So first up is ISO 14064 Part 1, which has a very catchy title. So as some of you may or may not be aware, achieving carbon neutrality is really about finding a balance between the greenhouse gas emissions you put into the atmosphere as a business, both directly and indirectly, and those you take out of the atmosphere through offsetting. So it's essentially about finding an equilibrium. Of course, in order to actually achieve this, you need to know what your emissions are in the first place, where they're coming from, over a specific time period. So that's where 14064 comes in. So the standard outlines a series of requirements for the quantification, so the number crunching, and the reporting of emissions. The standard places an emphasis on complete, transparent, and accurate quantification and reporting of these emissions. So as with most standards, it begins with defining your scope, or in this case, it is referred to as the organisational and reporting boundaries. This is very important here, as you can't simply say, you know, we're going to quantify everything and claim to be carbon neutral for everything. You really do need to outline specific locations you operate in and the activities your business carries out at these locations. You know, at the start, this is also the ideal, you know, point in the journey to get that leadership commitment, because that really does help throughout the process, particularly later down the line when you're collecting data and making decisions. In terms of the actual emissions, you should be looking at scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and considering the other indirect sources. So really paying close attention not to exclude anything significant. You know, for instance, you know, energy or vehicle mileage. You know, you can't purposely exclude something significant. But ultimately, you know, these boundaries, they need to be a really true and fair representation of your core activities. Businesses often ask me, you know, how do we decide what to include and what to exclude? So this is basically done via the control approach or the equity share approach. So the control approach is where you start essentially looking at the activities and the facilities you have operational or financial control over. And then the other sort of flip side to that is the equity share approach. So that's where you look at your proportion of emissions. A very sort of simplified practical example of this could be a factory. If you're responsible for, say, X% of the output, you could then say, you know, you're potentially responsible for X% of the emissions coming from that. For those of you who aren't familiar with how emissions are quantified, you take activity data, such as the miles driven by a specific vehicle, or for instance, the kilowatt hours used at a facility, and you multiply it by the corresponding conversion factor. So here's an example I've included for the factors you should use for a diesel car in the UK. So these are supplied by the UK government, and the standards do prefer you to use government factors where possible. In terms of, you know, availability of international conversion factors, that really does vary depending on the country. So in my opinion, and, you know, as a practitioner, this is the easy bit. You know, actually, you know, getting the data and applying these conversion factors. The hard bit is actually recording, obtaining and processing and tidying up the data in the first place. So that's the tricky part. Again, going back to cars, you know, getting mileage. It's a good example because, you know, most companies are very good at recording the travel expenses and the financial aspect of things, but they're not so great sometimes at recording the actual distances, you know, people drive, or the type of vehicle they use. So, you know, 14064 is a really great framework to help you get in the habit of collecting the important data you need and actually recording it in a usable format. So just a quick note on the scopes that the standards want you to look at. So quantifying your direct scope 1, so combustion at sources you own, and your indirect scope 2 emissions from purchased energy is generally a similar task for most organisations. Maybe not every single organisation, but at least for most, it's a bit simpler from my perspective. Where it does get a lot more complex are the indirect scope 3 emissions. That's essentially everything else, and not necessarily sources you own or have much control over. Many organizations are reacting this to making scope 3 emissions much more of a long-term goal. For instance, freight and supply chains, as this requires a lot more time and effort to quantify, and it involves potentially reaching out to external stakeholders, and it's generally a lot more complex depending on which area you're looking at. But the end product of this is a greenhouse gas inventory as required by the standards. So it essentially shows all your emission sources and removals. Just to note that the standard would like you to quantify removals where possible. So again, the greenhouse gas inventory, if you put it really, really simply, it's essentially a big list of all your emissions categorized into the greenhouse gas protocol categories for emission sources, and then the specific greenhouse gas outputs. So if you're looking at the individual ones, and then ultimately you report this in tons of CO2 equivalent. So that takes into account the individual global warming potential of each of the gases displayed on the screen. So yeah, so ISO 14064 in a nutshell, it's an international standard for the very high quality approach to quantifying and reporting on your emissions, which then feeds in quite nicely to PAS 2060. So PAS 2060. So here is the definition of carbon neutral directly from the standards. As we know, it's about finding that equilibrium in emissions, so the emissions that you put into the atmosphere through your activities and those you take out. So the standard outlines requirements for achieving carbon neutrality. This is via quantifying, so that's where the methodology of 14064 comes in, reducing and offsetting emissions. In terms of the actual time period mentioned in the definitions, is a 12-month period for most organizations. But this can be financial or calendar year, depending on which you think is most appropriate for your business. It does tend to align with accounting. The standard is designed to be applied to any organization, site, community, government. I believe it can even be applied to individuals. I'm yet to do that yet, but apparently it can be. As with 14064, you outline what is being looked at, but in this case, it's defined as the subject in PAS 2060. Again, as with the boundaries in 14064, you can choose to make your subject cover all your activities or just a very specific site or building or location. As long as you are accurate and transparent and don't exclude anything significant. Again, going back to your scope 1 and 2s, it'd be inadvisable to exclude those. You also need to outline the rationale for the selection of your subject. If it is a very narrow selection, for instance, just a single building or site or location, you have to be very clear why you've chosen this as opposed to your whole business, particularly if you are going down the verification route. The main document that comes out of this is the qualifying explanatory statement, which is a bit of a mouthful, so which QES for short. This is a collection of the relevant information and outlines how you achieved carbon neutrality, or should I say demonstrated carbon neutrality. As we know, and this may be up for debate, no business emits zero emissions, hence why offsetting is essentially vital at least at this stage, to achieving carbon neutrality. And I'm sure everyone has an opinion on offsetting, and we will come back to this in a moment. But for those of you who aren't familiar, offsetting involves a financial contribution to a project that either prevents greenhouse gas going into the atmosphere or directly removes them. So obviously you can't go back in time and make reductions. The standard wants you to make reductions, but you can't go back in time and do them on events that have already occurred. Due to this, you can achieve neutrality in your first reporting period solely via offsetting. Going forward, though, the standard will require you to develop and implement a carbon footprint management plan or carbon reduction plan and make reductions in each subsequent reporting period. So this really isn't a standard simply for just buying offsets each year. These can be intensity-based reductions. So for instance, tons of CO2 equivalent per employee or per £1 million of revenue, or per product or floor space. So I always say to potential clients and businesses, you really shouldn't be put off aiming for PAS 2060 just because you're planning to grow or expand in the future. You can evidence these reductions as efficiency improvements. And as Mel mentioned, you have the option with the standard to go self-verified, which many organizations are choosing to do in the first few reporting periods at least. Really does depend on the industry and what their competitors are doing, to be honest. Or at the other end of the scale, you can go for the independent third-party verification. Ultimately, the choice is yours, but you just need to be clear which one you've gone to in your formal declaration of achievement. But by making these reductions through your carbon footprint management plan and contributing to international offset projects, the standard really is a great way to help your business make a genuine positive impact on the environment and ultimately improve potentially the livelihoods of other people and the environment around them. So the complementary aspects of the standards, as we mentioned at the start, they do integrate very well and they essentially rely on each other in many ways. So here's the key ways they interact with each other. As I mentioned, you need to define what is traditionally referred to as your scope, or in this case, the boundaries and subject. Terminology aside, important part of this exercise is to ensure you include all the relevant emission sources and don't exclude something significant. For instance, you could choose to just start with your head office if that's all you've got data for and its activities and make that carbon neutral, as opposed to your whole organization if you feel that's appropriate. But you couldn't choose to ignore something significant within these boundaries, again, electricity or waste or water or fuel use. You'll then start identifying and quantifying the specific emission sources. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies have a very good handle on their scope 1 and 2s, and they're generally, at least from my perspective, the easier ones, caveat on that, but generally. But scope 3 is being a lot more complex and therefore a long-term goal. As like I said, you can't go back in time and gather data, so it's just about putting those measures in place to gather that data moving forward. In line with 14064, you'll display the individual sources of each relevant gas in an inventory. So again, the big list I mentioned, putting it simply, and this is for a specific time period. And perhaps the most important part of this is the incentive to make reductions over time through a carbon footprint management plan, / carbon reduction plan, depending on what you're calling it. You'll need to continually show evidence for absolute or intensity-based reductions over time to maintain your claim to pass 2060. So again, it's not just about purchasing offsets each year. The standards do require you to determine and evidence reductions each year. So how does this actually work in practice? So Carbonology, that's where we step in. So here's the overview of the journey of carbon neutrality from sort of square one all the way through to the declaration. So it begins with define stage. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a good point to get leadership commitment because that really does help later down the line. So getting leadership commitment to your goal of carbon neutrality, again, just an example, really helps with the data collection. That's just one example of many. But once you've got that, you'll begin outlining your organizational and reporting boundaries for your greenhouse gas inventory, which then essentially forms the subject of your past 2060 QES. Moving on from that is quantify, so that's the number crunching stage, so gathering all your primary data from sources such as expense claims, bills, meter readings, surveys, etc., and then converting this to tons of CO2 equivalent with those conversion factors I mentioned, as well as the individual GHGs. So moving on from that is the commit stage. So this is where you can commit to actually taking the practical steps to reducing your emissions in each reporting period. And this is via the development of a carbon footprint management plan. Produce, this is a stage where you actually implement your carbon footprint management plan and continually monitor the effectiveness of those reduction schemes to see if they're working or potentially not working. It's also very important at this stage to communicate the goals to your staff and relevant external stakeholders, and how you plan to achieve them is ultimately a group effort, particularly from an internal perspective, because staff will need to know how they can contribute and why you're doing this. So communication really is key to meeting those targets you've set. Moving on from that is re-quantify. So this is a cyclical process really. Each reporting period you'll need to re-quantify emissions, ideally using consistent methodologies to evidence reductions. You may be required to undertake a base year review if more accurate methods are available. So what that essentially means, if you come up with a better, more accurate, more reliable method, go back and apply that, if practical, of course, to get more accurate results. Moving on from that is offsets. This is where you actually go out and purchase your offset credits for each ton of CO2. And we'll touch on this in a moment, but the main point is you really need to ensure they're from credible third-party verified projects. And then finally is declare. So this is where you can issue your declaration of achievement of carbon neutrality in line with past 2060. This will also state whether you have self-verified or used an independent accreditation body to verify your carbon. You'll also need to include the proof of offsetting here. So what that means is the certificates and the evidence to show they are doing what they say they do on the tin. Then all you need to do is essentially repeat this each year, which sounds daunting, but most of the work is done in the first year, to be honest. So once you've got that out of the way and you've got the processes for collecting and tidying up the data, it is generally easier moving forward. So yeah, we couldn't have a presentation on carbon neutrality without a quick note on offsetting, because it can be a controversial topic at times. But the standard does outline a key set of requirements to make sure this is done to a high standard. So in case you weren't familiar what this actually involves, offsets are generally sold on a per ton basis from providers, such as those on the screen now. I'll load it. There we go. So if your emissions are, say, 500 tons of CO2 equivalent, you basically need to buy at least 500 credits to make yourself carbon neutral. Again, simplifying it, but it's not too different from online shopping, depending on the provider you go to. In the eyes of the standard, offsetting is not just a get out of jail free card. It does require you to actually make those reductions. Again, whether they're absolute reductions or a total reduction, or intensity-based reductions, so sort of demonstrating an efficiency improvement. We could probably make an entire webinar about offsetting and an entire debate around it, but here's a few of the key the key requirements of the standards for offsetting. So the main one is the projects need to be independently verified by a third party. So there's kind of two sides to this. A, it ensures they exist in the first place and are actually there, and B, that they're actually doing what they said they were setting out to do. So they're actually meeting their own objectives. The projects need to meet the greenhouse gas protocol requirements for additionality, permanence, leakage, and double counting, among others, which in a nutshell basically means they must actually represent genuine reductions that wouldn't have just occurred anyway. They mustn't lead to increased emissions elsewhere, so if you have a project in one place, it shouldn't lead to the emissions going up in another place. Projects must be long-lasting and not just a temporary fix. And the credits must be stored in an independent registry. As they cover a 12-month period, they must be retired after this 12 months, so this avoids double purchasing, so essentially someone else buying the same credit as you. So again, there's some providers on the screen. It's not the only providers, but it's some of the more popular ones that do sell offsets from projects that meet the requirements of past 2060. But just one final word on offsetting, it really is buyer beware. So why should companies aim for this? What's the point? Why should they pursue this? Because it's not something that happens overnight, and it does require a lot of commitment. So why should they aim for this? So climate change is happening. It's not a question of belief. Maybe there's certain uncertainties around it, but it is happening. That's not up for debate. We do need to take proactive steps, or we are all going to have a bad time at some point. I mean, look at the state of the world at the moment. We've got lots of extreme weather events, drought, desertification. It's getting worse generally. At local, national, and international levels, there are a number of agreements, targets, and legislations, and they aren't just abstract concepts. These are influencing the world in many ways and having repercussions for both people and businesses. From a business perspective, everyone does want one up on their competitors. So, a lot of businesses are monitoring each other to see who's claiming carbon neutrality and aiming for the same, or if not, bigger and better. A lot of the people that talk to me have, come to me because they've seen their main competitor do this and they want to, either copy them or, produce a bigger, better, glossier report that covers more things and goes into more detail. So there is a competitive element to it. I think, businesses and individuals are a lot more savvy of greenwashing at the moment, so they can recognize when you're greenwashing and, statistics aren't backed up. So aligning your work with international standards does definitely help combat this, and it makes your methods and, your work a lot more transparent. Best way to do this is essentially, publish everything within reason, and then people can see what the work you've done. So some of the benefits, which is very much an overlapping area, but it can save you money. Emission reductions occur because of real world actions. They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Reducing your mileage and energy use or eliminating certain activities does have the potential to save your business money. Seeing these standards can also help potentially paint a better picture of how your business operates. For instance, a better understanding of your supply chain could be gained from following these standards. As I just mentioned, consumers can recognize greenwashing now. So 14064 and past 2060 demonstrate that you really are taking a methodical approach to managing your emissions in alignment with internationally recognized standards. As we've mentioned a few times in this presentation, you've got that option at the end to have your work independently verified by a third-party verification body, which is arguably and generally seen as the most credible way to demonstrate confidence to stakeholders. And potentially above all else, you are generally helping to fight climate change and, improve the environment. Yeah, thank you for listening. If you would like to reach out for a chat with Mel or myself, details on the screen. So please feel free to drop me an email or give me a phone call at any time. And thank you for listening, and thank you for CIBSE for having us.
Thank you very much, David and Mel. That's very interesting. There's an opportunity now to ask questions using the question box. So get your questions in, and I'll pass them on to Mel and David. I've got a couple of questions myself. I'm sure I'm going to get questions on this going forward, so I'll ask some questions myself, if that's okay. Use chair's prerogative. You talked about PAS 2060 and ISO 1464 integrating. I think your slides suggest they dovetail very nicely. You mentioned 14,001 and 50,001 in passing, and I can see with this objective of cutting down your offsetting, either of those standards would be very helpful in doing that. But do they actually integrate? Is the 14 in 14064, does that suggest that there's, if you have 14,001 already, it would be much easier to implement 1464? Is that what you're saying?
This question, David. Actually, if we go back on the slide to the Carbonology, I can kind of explain where it can integrate with 14,001, if that's all right. Yeah. Okay, cool. So obviously I know there's a lot to take in on this slide, but if I just kind of go through how it could integrate with your 14,001, it might be beneficial. So obviously with ISO 14,001, if you're a certified 14,001 organisation, you will have defined your scope of certification. Okay, so this is very similar in that respect. So you could choose to look at the scope boundaries of your organisation, similarly to the way that you've done that for 14,001. Okay, you do need to have leadership commitment. So as we know, it is a requirement within 14,001 and 50,001 that you've got leadership commitment. Now it's leadership commitment to becoming carbon neutral. Or, that this can be part of your sustainability strategy, your environmental policy. So it can be weaved into many areas when it comes to leadership commitment. Okay, so as we know, leadership commitment can be demonstrated through your policy. So, you can, but with this, you could also include that commitment and pledge through your carbon footprint management plan or carbon reduction plan, whichever way you want to brand that. Okay, so there's a leadership commitment in there, and obviously with 14,001 you'll have objectives in place, you'll have an environmental aspects and impacts register in place, and again carbon can come into that at a more granular level as well. So you might have a specific objective that you want to set for the next 12 months as part of your, it could be a 3-year strategy to do with carbon neutrality. So that's one area. Another area is on the quantification stage, which is number 2. Okay, so again, this can help to support existing mechanisms that you've got in place on your environmental aspects and impacts. Okay, and then moving into the carbon footprint management plan, I think this is probably one of the main areas, because this is where you need to communicate how you're going to make those reductions. And if you've already got environmental controls in 14 or energy controls in 50,001, this is where you want to be able to get them working together. Okay, so commitment is crucial, but then communication of your carbon reduction plan is also really important too, because you want to get everybody sharing in that vision. You want everybody's input. You want them to feel empowered to take responsibility for making those reductions as well. So that could include, from a very simple switch off campaign, or moving over, to electric vehicles, and incentivizing staff to do these things, and to try and make it enjoyable and fun along the way as well. So there are lots of different ways that you can do that, and your EMS can be the foundation for making that happen as an organisation. Because the other factor with 14,001 is having roles and responsibilities. So obviously, ideally, you want to have your carbon neutrality champions, which could be the same as the champions that you've got that are involved in maybe sustainability committee or something like that. Okay. The second part, though, on reduction is, sorry, I know this is a long answer to your question, but there are lots of different clauses within 14,001 that can complement your carbon neutrality journey. I think the last one that I'll leave you with, and then I'll shut up, is monitoring measurement. Okay, so how do you know if you're going to get there? Okay, so obviously you have your objectives, but ideally you want to have key performance indicators as well, part of your EMS or ENMS, and you need to be able to monitor and measure how effective these controls are and if these reductions are actually working in practice. So they're absolutely crucial, so you can see if you are on the right path, and also to be able to report on your reductions and hopefully your successes along the way. So I think finally, you know, there isn't a requirement for internal audits, but you could obviously audit your carbon reduction plan and use 14064 and PAS 2060 as one of those other requirements in your legal register when it comes to understanding the applicable statutory, regulatory and contractual requirements. So this could very easily be one of those other requirements that you bring into the EMS fold. So hopefully that's answered that question.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mel. That's a very comprehensive answer. I had one other question, which is probably more of a yes or no answer. Slightly long question, but a yes/no answer, and that's just to make sure I understand this. If I'm an organisation and I've really got hold of this issue and want to do something about it, and I've invested heavily in wind turbines on site and PV on the roof of all my buildings and appropriately sized batteries, if I'm generating all of my own energy and I'm using a fleet of electric vehicles that are charging on site and only operating within a radius that they can come back and recharge, and I impose this discipline on my supply chain as well, have I satisfied this requirement?
I mean, short answer, yes. But then, of course, you know, there's emissions within those, you know, solar panels and electric cars and, you know, water and waste that come out of the building. So
yeah, it's never that simple.
It's never. I'll say yes, but it's never quite as simple as that in real life generally.
Okay, well, I'm going to wind things up there because we've still got all of our attendees with us, but none of them have asked any questions. Now, that's either because the presentation was very good and answered all their questions, which is probably part of the answer, but I'm going to take some credit as well. Maybe the question I've asked was the one they were all going to ask, and Mel's very comprehensive answer has dealt with that very well also. So I'll just finish by thanking both our speakers for covering that so comprehensively, and remind everyone that this and a recording of the presentation will be on our website, and including the contact details on that last slide, should you wish to get in touch with Mel or David for further information.
Yeah, we'll be more than happy to answer any. Oh, sorry to interrupt, Andrew, but I was just going to say, if somebody thinks of a question after this webinar, which I often do that when I'm listening to webinars, I think, oh, I wish I asked that question. Then yeah, feel free to get in touch with us, and more than happy to book in a time for a Teams meeting or a call just to kind of talk through, you know, any questions that you might have. If it's to do with any technical aspects specifically related to the standard, then David, our carbonologist, is definitely the best person to speak to. If you want to have a chat about standards generally and how this potentially integrates with other standards, then I'm more than happy to join that call as well. So yeah, feel free. Oh, and David, I think on the feedback, I think we've said that we can provide a couple of downloads as well for attendees today, or people that might be viewing this retrospectively after the live webinar. Which is a checklist that David's produced, so that if you're wondering where do we even begin and how to get started, we've got where to start on your journey to carbon neutrality checklist. And there's also a guide on carbonology as well that's available. So I think that's available through the CIBSE feedback form that you'll be sending out, I believe.
Yes, there'll be an exit survey where people can indicate they'd like copies of that. So yeah, thanks for the detail on that. So I will just finish by thanking everyone, both attendees and presenters, for an excellent first webinar of the year. Thank you all, and see you all at the next one.
Great, thanks very much for having us, Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.